Looks like it's just going to be you and me for lecture today, Sam. Okay. So chapter 3 is all about computer security. And I know that sounds kind of odd because, it's all stuff that we deal with computers, but specifically what we're talking about is direct attacks on computers, being able to commit things like virus intrusions, cross-site scripting, zero-day attacks, things like that. So we're talking about direct attacks on the hardware. So we're going to talk about how to manage patches, deal with antivirus adjustments, user account control, which is something that tends to annoy a lot of people because they're not exactly sure what it does, but it keeps giving these pop-ups. And then the process of recovering from an attack. So, of course, as we talked about in previous chapters, protecting personal computers is challenging because we have no magic bullet. We have no way of breaking through all of these potential attacks that exist. So as new attacks are created and as old attacks are revived, we have to make sure that we have several different defenses in place to keep our data secure. So the first thing that we worry about is something called malware, malicious software. It's a portmanteau. We're just combining those two words. This is software that enters a system without your knowledge or consent. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. Most of the time it's both. Now, this is going to perform unwanted and usually harmful actions. So this is just an example from Google Chrome on the right, where a site is known to contain malware via, they're using a bit.ly address, so they're using a contraction website. So let's say that you have a website that has a really long URL and you want to use something much shorter. Bit.ly helps you do that. But because of that, you have what's called a little bit of security through obscurity in certain cases, to where this is a flawed idea. The idea that the harder something is to find, the more secure it is. And remember, convenience and security have an inversely proportional relationship, but it is not to say the more inconvenient, the more secure. It just means that it's poorly designed in most cases. So using bit.ly intrinsically is not bad, but it can possibly conceal things that are negative. So these may throw up little red flags here and there. As with most things, one of my favorite quotes from House MD, which is a great show that was on Fox with Hugh Laurie for a while, was everybody lies. The corollary was that everybody screws up, and everybody does things for a reason. It can be a stupid reason, but there's a reason. So we have to look at our objectives. Why does malware exist? Why do we use these things? Well, malware exists to spread itself, propagation, to conceal its purpose. Malware has a much harder time carrying out what it intends to do if it's visible, and to in some way make profit for its creators. Now, profit obviously has a financial connotation, but that is not the only method by which profit can be gained. Sometimes it can be, sometimes it can be just people will do it. You'll hear the phrase "for the lulz." People will do it because they think it's funny, because they're some kind of pseudo anarchist. In certain cases, it can be for political ideology. It can be revenge against a company that has either actually or allegedly performed some wrong that was perceived by the person that created this software. Now, there are different types of malware, and the first one we'll talk about is malware that spreads. So as we look back at the previous slide, we see here rapidly spreading the infection, of course. This is computer code that reproduces on a single computer. So this is not something that necessarily is as concerned with jumping from host to host. That would be more something like a worm. The methods of spreading a virus are that the virus is attached to a file. There is a process called a jump instruction, which tells the program to go from one memory location to another. The virus essentially inserts a jump instruction that instead of sending it to the normal code, will send it to the virus code first. Now, usually, after the virus code executes, it will go ahead and send a jump instruction back to the normal program, so that way it runs, again, in a concealed manner. There are two different types of infections that can occur, what's called an appender infection, and this is where we have it just kind of tagged on at the end, and then the Swiss cheese infection, which is where we have portions of code injected throughout the program. So here we have the two things diagrammed. We have the program code at the very top. Jump instruction says here, go down to the virus code, run that, and it probably links
You're making
back
me
up to the top. And then when we get to the Swiss cheese infection, there's more than one jump instruction. Each segment jumps to another piece. And this is so that different types of detection methods are harder to implement. You can't just truncate the end of the program code and cut off the virus if the virus code is spread throughout. So viruses tend to cause a lot of different problems. You can have a system that crashes because the virus makes everything unstable, causes memory leaks, things like that. You can have annoying messages, pop-ups that occur even without a connection to the internet, erasure of files, corruption of files, consumption of storage, what we would call a mob replicator. Essentially, it keeps doubling and doubling and doubling. Disabling security, and then reformatting the hard drive, just completely wiping it. Not necessarily any of these would be stuff you'd want to see. So viruses are something to avoid. And viruses, of course, can be spread in the virtual world just as easily as they can be spread in the physical world. We can move through email and other electronic contacts, social networking, text messages, internet downloads, and even what we call drive-bys. So if you go to a website and there's a particular pop-up, it may take advantage of a cross-site script or an injection of some kind to make a web page pop up a window that automatically downloads a program to your computer, just like you were downloading an image from a website. You know, if you load up CNN, you know, all of those things have to be downloaded to your machine to be viewed. Now, a virus can only replicate locally without the user taking some form of action. So that's not to say that a virus cannot spread outside of its host machine. It's just that on its own, the self-replication process, it can't move into a network environment. Now, there are two primary types of viruses we talk about. Program virus, which deals with executables, the exe files and bat files, etc. And then the macro virus. Macros are just small collections of scripted events that can be put into a document. Now, in order to improve the functionality of documents and things of that nature, especially Word documents and Excel spreadsheets, there's a lot of what we call macro encryption or macro encoding. So these macros basically just include small bits of executable script that allow you to have certain functions. If you want to have you know, a certain type of calculation, like a custom function, things like that inside of an Excel spreadsheet, that usually requires use of a macro. And that can even extend into what they call VBA. It's a type of visual basic programming that you can use for Excel spreadsheets. Again, it's very lightweight, but it is powerful enough to be able to create some very malicious items. If you'll ever notice, when you download a document from an email source or from a website, it'll say, hey, this originated from the web. Do you want to enable editing, or do you want to just leave it in view-only mode? So if you're in view-only mode, you have that little preview. Macros do not execute. But if you hit editing, all of a sudden, anything that was in there that was executable code has permission to run. So you always want to be careful about documents that come from sources you don't trust.
Now, is it possible to have a virus and know it?
To have a virus and not know it? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that happens all the time. So that's why it's so important to make sure that your antivirus definitions and program updates are taken care of as regularly as possible. I believe most of them can be configured to be checked, I think, every 12 to 24 hours. So yeah, definitely make sure that you're being proactive in protection that way, because yeah, there's tons of occasions where you'll have a virus and not be aware. Now, we talked about how viruses can't spread unless a user gets involved. Well, there is another side. There's a worm. Worms are malicious programs that look for vulnerabilities in an operating system or in an application and try and use it to copy itself, not only locally, but over a network. So it's all about self-propagation across as broad an environment as it can. So worms, of course, don't necessarily worry about consuming local resources. They worry about consuming network resources. Your computer can be controlled remotely under the influence of a worm. It can delete files. You know, a lot of the same things that a virus can do, a worm can do. But the big deal is it controlled locally or is it controlled remotely? And can it make influence on your machine that could be negative directly under someone else's influence? So a little table just to kind of give that inclusion, how they spread, how they infect, and then user action versus remote controlled infection. Now, another type of malware we talk about is malware that conceals itself. So concealing malware, stuff that focuses on trying to hide its operation, would be things like Trojans, rootkits, backdoors, and what we call ACE attacks, arbitrary code execution. So a Trojan contains hidden malware under the guise of something that would be useful and benign. It wouldn't be anything malicious. It would be something that would be considered useful. So the Trojan then gets installed, usually with user approval, because you think you're installing a game or a video editing program or anything else. But this program has been corrupted with something that is contained within that does something else, named for the Trojan Horse, the big wooden horse left by the Greeks at the siege of Troy. You know, they were like, hey, we're just going to bail, and you know, this is going on for 10 years. So they took off and left this big wooden horse in front of the gates of Troy. What the Trojans did not realize is that the horse was full of Greek soldiers. So they brought the horse inside of the city gates, and when everybody went to bed, the soldiers hopped out and put everybody to the sword. So again, it looks like a gift, looks like something positive, but inside, of course, is something very dangerous. Now, Trojans traditionally do not replicate, locally or otherwise. They rely on the actions of users to be able to spread them. So this is why it's so common to see malware of this type on sites that promote piracy. So if there's, you know, an MP3 download or a video download, things like that, they'll sometimes be in a RAR file or other compression file, and then you have to open it up, and when you open up the compression file, it does something else to run the Trojan or run the script. So that can be an example of where you might see something like that. Of course, pirated software also. A rootkit is a set of software tools used by an attacker that tries to gain what they call root access, trying to gain access to the root drive, the root directory, administrative capacity. Now, a rootkit not only will conceal itself, but can sometimes conceal the presence of other malicious software. So a lot of these, whether they intend to or not, will often work in tandem to try and conceal their actions and make them more efficacious. So some of the actions that they'll carry out will be things like deleting logs, changing permissions, changing the operating system to ignore potentially malicious activity. So things that would be, you know, normally red flagged immediately by antivirus, anti-malware, etc., would be like, nah, we'll just let it go. We're gonna ignore this particular problem. Or maybe they'll set a particular program to have elevated permissions so that it's able to access content. So when you log into Microsoft Word, that will give administrative permissions to, you know, your internet browser or something else that will allow it to automatically download other types of malware from a preset site. Backdoors, these are software code pieces that give access to a program or service. Basically what it does is it circumvents normal security protections because this is created as part of the normal process. So during development, in certain instances, especially if they're testing a new form of security, developers will leave a backdoor in place so that it's easy to access the program without having to constantly go through the database and make sure that your passwords and whatever else are correct. The problem with this is if these pieces of code are not removed in the released program, it's very simple to go in and use a simple hex editor to reactivate these particular backdoors. So all of a sudden, this really, you know, tough program just has like a, you know, it's like a screen door on a submarine. Very easy to break in. So In certain cases, depending on the code structure, malware can actually install a backdoor where there was not one. So, your computer normally has all of its ports correctly secured. This malware comes in, opens up, the RDP port, so that way you can have remote desktop access, and then puts the administrative permissions for a preconceived default, something else that was set up. So just as simple as changing a couple of permissions and having a program sitting and waiting to listen for instructions from some outside source. Keyloggers, these are particularly insidious because they're really, really hard to track down. They can be done either in a hardware or software format. So hardware that captures keystrokes would normally be something like a what's called a USB dongle, goes in between the keyboard and the USB port. Software keyloggers are a little bit different because, again, with software, if you're well aware of what type of image you have, or if you're using a diskless machine for like a kiosk or something similar, so it's running from optical media like a DVD has like a very lightweight operating system, then it's really hard to be able to run those kinds of loggers if the machines are reset regularly. But the hardware ones, those can be plugged in. They have a little micro SD card, and then the person comes by later and retrieves the logger, and then all the information that has gone between the USB port and the keyboard plug has been copied. And Unicode characters and text is very easy to store in a compressed capacity. We also have things called arbitrary code executions, or ACE attacks. Now, the idea is that this is going to manipulate the buffer area of a computer in order to gain control of the machine. So the buffer is just a storage area on the computer that retains the return address information for the processor. So as a stack of instructions is being processed, you can almost think of it like water filling up a jug. Now, eventually, if you have too many instructions, or the instructions are quote-unquote too large, meaning that it's violating 32-bit or 64-bit instruction rules, it overflows the buffer. It goes too large, and it kicks back that return address to make sure that the computer can still maintain control of the OS. It'll just disengage that program. So the idea is when this happens, in the buffer, the return address for malware code is substituted for that of the processor. So essentially, it overflows the buffer and says, oh, no, don't go to this. You're going to go to the real CPU, which is actually the malware code. You also have what are called botnets or zombie webs. So botting is the process of a program taking control of a victim's computer for extended periods and allowing it to perform particular actions. So things like being able to submit votes for an online poll, or carrying out what we call a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service. All of these things are entirely possible under a botnet. The individual computer that is controlled is called a zombie. The bot is the program that allows the computer to be controlled. The botnet is a group of zombies together. And then you have what's called a bot herder. Bot herders are attackers that will control zombies using HTTP commands, sometimes also ICMP commands. So you have a bot herder that may be in one particular area, and they're able to access a DNS server or some other large form server. They issue the command, and then any computer that's within reach of those particular subsystems that has the bot code running will then respond to it. So you have this giant web of machines that can be controlled by a single person or a small group of people. I think the largest botnet that is currently on record is somewhere around like 1.8 or 2 million computers being engaged simultaneously, and I think that was in France. They were the perpetrators of that botnet were recently caught by French police. So I thought that was a very interesting outcome. Botnets can remain active for years pretty easily, depending on whether or not a particular system is well designed or well hidden. So what would botnets be for? Of course, we talked about the DDoS, things like that, but we also have spamming. Being able to send spam email or being able to spam requests to a website That's something that is often carried out by botnets, just because if you have a bunch of legitimate IP addresses, it's very hard for a machine to determine, hey, this machine's behavior seems unusual, so I'm going to ignore it. So if you have one computer sending out 100 requests, that can sound a little funky, but if you have 100 computers, each sending out one request, that tends to seem a little bit more legitimate, and it tends to go unnoticed, but the same effect is produced. Spreading malware, of course, being able to send out the creation of new zombies and other botnets. As I said, manipulating online polls, and then being able to deny services by, flooding servers or things like that. Depending on whether or not you're dealing with a distributed network, you can have what's called just a denial of service attack, where one machine does it, or a very small group. And then distributed denial of service is where you have multiple machines. We also have malware that attempts to gain some form of profit. Now, spam email, massive as it is, I think it registers in the trillions of emails that are sent every year, is often a way to try and generate profit by means of various clicker scams. Sometimes it'll be as simple as downloading a spyware client, something that attaches to your web browser or to your operating system and keeps an eye on what you're doing without your consent, of course. Now, there are legal forms of spyware that exist. So I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it was Nielsen, I think it was Net Ratings or Net Opinions. So the Nielsen company, of course, does a lot of statistics on entertainment and things like that, and they'll sometimes send you a booklet and $5 and be like, hey, can you tell us what you've been watching on TV or streaming services for this period of time? Just log what you're watching and for how long, and we can get an idea of what's popular, what's not, and try and improve content, what's available. So spyware can be done in a legal form, and that is because it's involving your consent, and they're remunerating you in some capacity. They're paying you. Now, spyware doesn't do any kind of payment, anything else. It's just going to collect it, secretively. So controlling use of system resources, controlling collection of personal information, controlling the user experience, impacting privacy, and of course, in certain cases, damaging or modifying system security. So spyware can use things like automatic download software, as we talked about with Trojans and things like that earlier, passive tracking technologies, system modification software, tracking software so they can find information about what you're doing, both passively and actively. Now, spyware, of course, because it consumes resources to do what it needs to do, can create slow system performance, instability. All of a sudden, your browser will have extra toolbars, extra menus, your cursor may change, your home page will have changed, various shortcuts. Pop-ups will increase, or pop-ups that normally you wouldn't have seen will then come through, stuff that can bypass your antivirus software possibly. A more aggressive form of spyware, a little bit more overt, would be something like adware. Now, adware is going to provide advertising content. It's like fractions of a cent every time somebody sees one of these pop-ups, and then maybe a couple of pennies if somebody clicks on it. But these ads will pop up in an unexpected and unwanted manner. As I said earlier in the lecture, we talked about pop-ups that came through even without an internet connection being present. So adware, of course, can pop up various things. They can change your web browser behavior. They can pop up the web browser at random intervals. They may display objectionable content. Of course, the old adage that sex sells is true. There are a lot of pornography sites and various things that will try and promote themselves through things like adware. And the way that they try and pop things up is that they will try and direct your focus, meaning your mouse. They'll move your mouse directly to the center of the pop-up when it opens, so that if you try and click away from it and you're not paying attention to where your mouse is, it will launch whatever it is, trying to give an implied permission to access things. Now, of course, because of all these pop-ups, you got to close everything out. Yeah, this is going to probably interfere with user productivity, as you might imagine. And the adware will also probably carry out some of the functions of spyware, trying to track and monitor your various activities. Scareware, of course, this is software that is going to display some form of fictitious warning. They may also be included as part of what we call ransomware, where they'll try and prevent you from being able to access your machine until you have paid some kind of fee or something. They'll try to impel you to take action. They'll try and usually impart some form of urgency, like this is the FBI, your machine has been seized as part of an illegal process, contact blah, 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 in order to have it released. And it's all nonsense, of course. If the FBI really wanted to seize your machine, you'd have boots on your door, to go ahead and get all your stuff. They will use what looks like legitimate trademarks, icons, what we call livery, the appearance of a particular affiliation. So, stuff that looks like it comes from Verizon or whoever your IP ISP is, Spectrum, things like that. Maybe you'll have a pop-up that tries to perform a fake security scan. Essentially, it's just a GIF that will say your version of Flash or your version of Google Chrome or your version of Firefox is out of date. Click to fix, blah, blah, blah. Purchase of a full version of a piece of software to fix your problems, update your drivers, speed up your Windows machine, whatever else. All of these one-click fixes are usually just trying to get you to click on there's different types of malware to launch a particular site, to download spyware or adware to your machine. Once the quote-unquote purchase is made, then the credit card number or whatever method was used is then stolen by the attacker and either sold or used directly to make fraudulent purchases. So how do we defend ourselves against all this mess? Well, first thing, of course, we want to make sure we're managing our patches and updates correctly, installing antivirus and anti-malware software, dealing with personal firewalls, using the UAC correctly, the user account control, protecting against theft, creating backups, and knowing how to recover from an attack. So what is a patch? A patch basically says that after a piece of software is released, if there's a hole or some kind of issue where we have a vulnerability, we will go ahead and include an update to fix it. There are collections of cumulative updates called service packs, which will also be released periodically. So these service packs allow you to say, from X window of time to Y window of time, if I download the service pack, everything that was available to me for updates will be included, especially if there are patches that are sequential. Let's say they're trying to fix a particular problem, but the fix makes another problem appear, or it makes another issue functionality, maybe not necessarily something dangerous, but it changes something that users did not necessarily want changed, so then they have to put it back but still figure out a way to fix the problem in the first place. So patches can sometimes be a little bit circular, where they're chasing their own tail. When you get to the service pack point, hopefully the best patch out of the group or a cumulative patch has been released, so you don't have to reinstall the same thing 6 times. Now, modern operating systems can perform automatic updates if you've given them permission, but you have to be sure that you are getting them from the correct source and that you're following the instructions on screen. So if it says, hey, once this is finished, you need to go ahead and restart, make sure that you're not in the middle of something important, because it may restart automatically. You have to probably provide certain credentials, click OK, things like that. So just be aware of what the instructions are on screen. Don't just blindly click yes to whatever pops up on your screen. That happens to a lot of people and ends up causing them a lot of stress because they are essentially giving permissions to different types of malware. So for updates, generally what they recommend is for you to automatically download and install them. You can change different variations of that to where you download it and then choose whether to install it. You have a manual update check, or you never check unless you go in and click the button. My order of recommendation, of course, goes down further down that list we go. I have automatic updates installed myself. I recommend that for pretty much anyone. Your computer is going to have a regular schedule so it doesn't forget, and make sure that your patches and everything else are good to go. Oh, sorry, at the bottom here it says operating system updates may include updates from other software vendors. Now this depends. So if you have a computer from Dell will usually submit security patches through Windows Update to make sure that their machines stay as current as possible, so they don't have to include their own Dell-based system just for their updates. They can kind of piggyback. And then, of course, Microsoft will include stuff for its own products. So if you use something like Visual Studio or Microsoft Office, those updates will be included there as well. So antivirus software, as you might imagine, is software that acts in opposition to viruses, worms, and other types of malware. So the process by which it does this is by scanning, detection, and quarantine, and then, of course, later removal. So it looks for infections based on what are called virus signatures. These are snippets of code that identify a particular virus string, some kind of indicator that the virus is present. It will monitor your computer's activity. It will monitor new downloads, new documents, things like that, to try and make sure that anything that pops up that may be considered viral or considered malware in any capacity is at least indicated to you like, hey, this seems kind of suspicious. Now, depending on what program you use, the way this is reported, the aggressiveness and the complexity of the signatures may vary. There is also a process that we call heuristics, Heuristics. Heuristics is the process of examining behavior rather than looking for virus signatures. So heuristics basically says if we witness something that seems unusual, if we see a particular set of behaviors that indicate there might be something malicious, we can then flag that the same way we would with a virus. Now, of course, sketchy behavior, very much like in the real world, is not intrinsically illegal, so there might be some false positives that you trigger. So, of course, being aware of potential problems by examining those reports is critical. So the recommended configuration, of course, is to continually update your virus signature definitions, make sure that your virus monitoring is in real time, and then wherever possible, make sure everything is locked down and only enable options that you absolutely need to have open. So, turn on all the different options for antivirus, and then only if something dramatically gets in your way should you disable it. Now, a personal firewall. Now, there are a couple of different things that we can deal with firewall-wise. We have what are called corporate firewalls, we have hardware-based firewalls, and we have software-based firewalls. Software-based firewalls are designed to examine incoming data and block certain content based on, again, signatures and behavior. There are application level firewalls, there are stateful and stateless firewalls. There are firewalls that behave differently based on the type of configuration they possess. You can allow certain programs, even if their behavior would seem erroneous or potentially malicious. It just depends on whether or not you know what that software is doing. So here we can see a personal firewall versus a network firewall. The location, of course, is going to change whether or not it is local to a host or on the perimeter of the network, usually between a group of hosts and an exterior network, so between a router and a local switch, or between a router and a local host. The scope of protection, of course, is going to be different. On a personal computer, personal firewall is going to cover just that single area. It's kind of like, if you're wearing sunglasses on a bright day, it's not going to do anything for anybody else's eyes, it's just going to do it for yours. On the other hand, if you're using something like going into a large building, then that covers everybody. That's a much broader scope. The type of firewall that you might see, software-based, of course, is going to be local versus a hardware device, which would be separate. Now, something I want you guys to be aware of is that the only thing that changes how a particular device is termed, whether it's a router, switch, hub, firewall, etc., is the software. I have seen people who will take old laptops and customize them to where they behave in the same way as a router or behave in the same way as a firewall in order to create things like a DMZ, demilitarized zone, which is just a space between two firewalls. So don't always get caught up in the idea that you have to buy specific hardware. In certain cases, if you have an aptitude for it, you can actually homebrew it a little bit. So the recommendation for firewalls is to turn everything on the firewall, block everything, and only create exceptions for connections that we know about. So rather than letting everything run and only, basically red flagging it whenever it's a problem, what we would call blacklisting, we instead want to go ahead and do a whitelist instead, to where everybody's blocked unless we say you're good to go. Now the UAC, this is one that of course annoys a lot of people. Again, like I said, because it pops up a lot. People are constantly like, what is this thing doing? Well, what it's doing is trying to prevent a program from running in the background and saying, oh, I'm going to try and run with administrative permissions. So a user account indicates your level of privilege. Privilege coming from the same words as legislation and privacy. So all privilege means is private law or individual law. So this means that privilege indicates that there are things that you have the ability to do that someone else may not have the ability to do. So it's a much better explanation of what that word actually means in a general context. We hear privilege these days and we automatically go to the social definition. But privilege here basically just says what files and folders can you access, what type of changes can you make. Now there are three different types of user accounts that we traditionally talk about. The big two are the standard account and the administrator account. Standard account just allows you to do basic functionality. Administrator allows you to make major changes. Now note that I said three because there is also the guest account. This is basically a subset of the standard account, which gives you the least amount of control. There are things that you can do as a standard registered user that you cannot do as a guest. The guest usually just allows you to access certain what we would call mainstream programs. So the user account control, when it pops up, will alert you to when an operating system event is triggered that is asking permission to perform a particular task. So if you have a Trojan, if you have a Rootkit, anything like that running, this helps to prevent it from gaining administrative access. Even if you are logged in as an administrator, you will still see this box pop up. Now, as an admin, you can just click yes or no, and it will allow you to proceed as per normal. On the other hand, if you're a standard user, you will have to enter administrative credentials to proceed. So the recommended configuration is to always notify, and that most users, the majority of your users, should be given standard accounts. Only if they need a particular administrative control should you then start shifting the ability to access those things without some kind of outside influence. So there are the four different primary levels of the UAC. Always notify, basically every time that there is a task that the UAC might consider potentially dangerous, it'll let you know, all the way down to never notifying any changes that are made to the computer. Now, of course, being a security-minded person, anything below, I would say, the top two levels, to where, you start removing that level of intrusion. The big difference between levels 2 and 3, as you can see, is that the higher level, the default setting, is it's going to dim your desktop, everything kind of goes dark, and it pops up the window that makes you focus on it before you can proceed. If we go below that, it will go ahead and pop up a little window, but it's very easy to ignore it because it doesn't darken the screen, and there are easier ways to kind of skip out of it. Whereas the never notify should, in my opinion, never be used. You never want to have a situation where something's running in the background of your machine that you do not know about, especially when it's requesting administrative permission. Creating data backups, of course, this is part of Security 101, well, CTI 120, if you will. You don't ever want to have anything in a digital form that, if you lost, would be utterly catastrophic. So that's why, cloud services are so critical now. I'm sure you guys heard about the fire in California. I think it was about 2 years ago, where there were a ton of things that got burned when a studio storage vault caught fire. There were original negatives, and there were, I think it was Universal, and they lost movies, they lost master tapes for recordings of music. So there was a ton of material that got burned. And if you don't have backups of those things, it can be very difficult to make sure that you are protected in the event of a failure. So backups allow you to restore a computer to its properly functioning state. I personally have a ton of different backup systems going for various things. I use OneDrive, I use Dropbox, I use Google Drive, I use iCloud on my phone. I have a ton of different ones to protect my digital information, and it all goes to different sources. Now, granted, there are certain things that I do not store in a digital form. There are certain things that I still leave on paper, and certain things like that, like my marriage license, things like that you have to have on hand, my birth certificate. Those are things that you don't want to exactly digitize and then toss the originals, because the court doesn't necessarily want those digitals, because they can be altered so easily. So you have to have those notarized paper copies. So again, even for somebody who's as technologically minded as I am, and somebody who lives in that computer space so often, there is still a lot to be said for having pen and paper backups or printed backups. Now, modern operating systems have the ability to do, time capsule or various types of backups automatically. But again, for certain sensitive materials, do you create just the one backup? Do you back things up to a hard drive? Do you back them up to an optical drive where you burn them to disk? Do you back them up to a floppy, well, not floppy, but a USB drive, something that would be a small portable type of storage? Wow, really dated myself with that floppy reference. It's funny, though, because part of it was I was looking at a program in the background, and of course the save button for a lot of these programs is a floppy disk. So like Notepad++, which is what I'm looking at right now, if you have multiple windows open, they have the save all, which is basically just a stack of floppies, and it cracks me up, because people will automatically equate that with saving their information, but maybe not necessarily understand where the origin of that came from, and how different it was trying to save things 1.4 megabytes at a time, as opposed to, even the smallest CDs when they first came out were still 600 megs. So your strategy for backups, of course, should be, what am I saving, and where should it be stored? There are salt mines in the middle of Kansas where people will go and take and store things because of the low level of moisture, and the very prime preservative environment that offers. In certain cases, people will go ahead and back up a hard drive, seal it in a bag, put it in a box, and ship it off to these vaults underground in order to keep things backed up. The Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints Church, they have some of the genealogical records, family records on the planet. They have a project that they've been running for decades now to try and do genealogy projects to help the populace, and a lot of those backups are done onto magnetic tape, and then they are stored in underground vaults, very similar to what I was just discussing. So again, what is the data? How hard would it be to recover it? And then where should we put it so we can be sure that in the event of a fire, or in the event of an earthquake, or the event of theft, where can we make sure that these are in a secure location? So of course, here's some different items that can be used for external storage. The one that I didn't mention earlier was the network attached storage, or the NAS. Network attached storage allows us to store things that are in multimedia formats, and many different network devices can be used to access this. So you can have a hard drive that's connected directly to your network, or connected via a web server, whatever else. And the good thing is with network attached storage, we can use cloning techniques and things like that in order to duplicate it to where one NAS can exist in several different locations. That's how, Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, all of these video streaming services make sure that people can access their materials. They have data centers all across the country, and then of course all over the world, that will allow, hundreds if not thousands of users to be able to access a single group of servers, and then there are multiple servers geographically spread out across the country. You can of course have what's called automated continuous backup, usually referred to as CDP, continuous data protection. And then universal access is available if you're online, because all you need is a web browser, and usually maybe a program to act as an FTP client to move from that remote resource to your local source. And then of course you can get file feedback information if a particular file is red flagged because of potential malicious content, or is experiencing a very high level of change. That can be marked as an essential file, things like that. Something else about online backup capabilities is that you can back up program files as well. So let's say that you have a file that is a database piece for a program, and it would be very difficult for you to back it up in other capacities because of permissions or things like that. That situation can be remedied by certain types of online backup procurement systems. Delayed deletion. For those of you who have iPhones, if you delete a photo, for example, there is a trash bin that now exists. It'll say deleted, and you'll have, I believe, up to 30 days for it to sit in there before it's automatically deleted. But before that, it can be retrieved. So it's just kind of a quote-unquote, are you sure moment. If you delete this and you didn't mean to, there's a way to recover it within a certain time frame. Or you can use what's called an online or disk-based restore. So if you have this online backup, you can use a disk, sometimes kind of like a key, or you can have an online backup system using credentials to be able to retrieve your information and restore your computer system. So the last thing we'll talk about today is recovering from an attack. The idea is that when an attack occurs, we have to have A, preparation before it comes down, B, how do we mitigate the attack while it's occurring, and C, what do we do once the attack is done? So we'll go ahead and create preparatory materials. We'll have a backup ready to go. Sorry, had a phone call pop up. Being able to go through and make sure that you have everything logged. And this is part of what we call business continuity. Being able to say, this is where we're at now, this is our current state of affairs, and then this is our possible rate of loss, things that could occur if something goes wrong. Our traditional method for an individual is to create a system repair disk to make sure if Windows goes kaput that we can recover it. Backing up of individual files, things like that. Traditionally, what we have are rescue disks that can be generated via the operating system itself or by various software vendors. So if you go through a company like Dell or Lenovo, they'll usually have the ability to create what's called a bootable DVD from a drive image. So let's say that your particular system has a certain set of drivers and things like that. This disk will essentially read your system, identify the critical files, and then back them up to this optical drive. So that is Security Chapter 3. Again, a lot of different things that you've probably heard before in different zones of IT, just kind of pulling it together, being aware of what's going on your machine, trying to mitigate potentially dangerous external sources, and being able to fight against those by means of backups, by means of prevention, and by means of mitigation through various preventative scheduling that we can do, things that we can do to kind of prepare and say, okay, if the worst happens, this is what we'll do. Any questions or concerns about what we've just addressed?